Hello, and welcome to the Board Game Barrage podcast. This is episode 139. 212. I throw that little joke in there for listeners in the know because we are unfortunately without the services of the Red Tank Kellen, but instead, I would say we've upgraded to none other than the Blue Tank Christina.
Hello.
And with me, as always, my faithful compatriot, Neelan, the Orange Tank.
Hello.
So how's it feel being without
Pretty good. I mean, the episodes can only be better.
That's right. That's right.
It feels weird not hearing catchphrase.
So while we have three...
Wait. Should we say the slogan in his honor?
I mean, I have taken a hardline stance against it. I don't know what Christina...
Mark.
We can say it, Neelan.
Okay.
You're going to simultaneously say it?
Yes.
Okay.
Board Game Barrage, the podcast about
board games, the latest hotness, and how to have fun with your friends, even when you're losing.
Perfect.
I definitely know the slogan.
Well, it's appropriate that both of you say that because while we are three here, today's episode, we're going to be talking about two-player games. So we're going to be covering what we think of them, our experiences with two-player games, some of our favorites, some of our least favorite two-player games. And so all that is coming up in the main portion of our show. But before we talk about that, we are going to be going over another set of two-player games that we recently got a chance to play. Christina starting us off with Undaunted Normandy. I'll follow that up with Fields of Arle. And finally, Neelan will talk about That Time You Killed Me. The game, not the actual time.
Yes. That fateful night.
That's right. So, Christina, tell us a little bit about Undaunted Normandy.
All right, I'd love to. So, Undaunted Normandy is a nice little two-player deck building game where you are fighting over... Well, you're in World War II, so one player is the Americans, and then the other player is Neelan. Neelan refused to be the Americans. There were several occasions where he accidentally had the Americans' cards, and he was just kept trying to get rid of them.
Okay.
And I just think it's very symbolic. I think he's having a crisis of identity.
Okay, to be clear, before you defend yourself, Neelan, you would rather refuse the Americans than play as I'm going to call them the Germans in World War II. I won't use the other term.
Yeah, the Germans in World War II, right?
Yeah.
The right honorable Germans.
Neelan, when he said he wanted to be the Germans, did not use the word the German.
Okay, let me defend myself.
Yes, you
The Americans were on Christina's side of the board, and I accidentally gave her the German cards, and then we realized, okay, this would have been easier if instead of swapping all of the cards that we just laid out in front of us, we just swapped whose side we were on. But in some reason in my head, it still made more sense to just rearrange the entire table. Anyway, that's my poor defense.
Yeah, I think it's okay. I mean, you just became an American.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's
It
still
feels
new.
weird.
It feels weird, yeah.
It's a coin flip, Americans or Germans in World War II.
I will say the Americans had much angrier faces on the cards than the Germans. The Americans were ready to kill.
Right.
And kill they did.
There you go. That's what I like to hear.
But, they didn't win. But they did kill.
Neelan really played the Germans in World War II very aggressively.
Yeah.
He really did. He really
rewriting history over here.
God, good job.
Yeah.
Oh, no. Oh, boy. Board Game Barrage. Podcast. No. I'm just... Okay. We're here to talk about board games, and a board game we're going to talk about right now is called Undaunted Normandy. It is, like I said, a deck builder. There are different scenarios, so every single game you're playing with a completely different setup, and you are attacking your opponent. You have different abilities depending on what scenario and what characters you have access to in your deck. It's a very tight game for the amount of things that you're able to do. It kind of replicates war games, but it takes 40 minutes to get a complete game done. Part of that is because there's only two players, but it has all of the tension that you want in the war games. There are some interesting mechanics that make that happen. You have really tight decisions because every single turn you only draw 4 cards. And with one of those 4 precious cards, you have to use one. You have to discard it, basically to bid for the first player token. So you kind of decide if you want to just get rid of the cards that are just fluff in your deck, which are called Fog of War, which is very nice thematically. And then you basically know that you're not going to get first player. Or you have to get rid of a really, really strong card, really, really strong abilities for your turn because you just know that you have to go first. And in the beginning of your games, you might not necessarily feel that need to go first, but it really starts to make a difference once you get in there and you get in each other's territory and you start fighting, because the attack system is really, the closer you are to one another, the stronger the attack system is. And so it makes a huge difference if you go first, because you can move close to somebody, you can attack them and completely get rid of their hand of cards if you attack the same person or if you attack the right person on the board that you assume they probably have in their hand.
Yeah, because the way that works is like every single time you inflict a casualty, that card is being permanently removed from that player's like deck or hand, and the first place you look is their hand. So if you're going before them, you're literally stripping them of cards before they get to go.
Yep, exactly. So it's basically just an area control game. The objective is to control different territories for victory points. And as soon as somebody hits 5 points, as one player hits 5 points, the game ends immediately. So it creates this very tense back and forth where once you get like literally 25, 30 minutes into the game, you start feeling like, oh my gosh, I could win on this turn. Or like, oh my gosh, Neelan is literally in a position to win. Like I have to kill his riflemen. What are they called? Riflemen?
Yeah.
His riflemen. So it's very interesting. Neelan, what did you think about Undaunted Normandy?
Yeah, I loved it. Especially like in those scenarios you're describing where like as you get towards the end of the game, that bid for turn order is suddenly vital, because we realized like even on the last turn, like if I was able to go first, it suddenly meant that I could win before you get your turn, which is huge. The thing I liked about it so much is like it doesn't feel as abstract as like a deck builder might make you think, because every card represents like one person in a squad on your board. And if all the cards are gone from your deck, then that token comes off of the board. You can sometimes bring it back if you have enough people in your supply, but it does feel like you're dealing with like this finite resources, crass, but like this finite amount of people. And every time someone dies, it hurts.
It's very painful. You really feel they also have names. So each rifleman has a name. So every time that Neelan is attacking one of my riflemen, I know it's like Neelan is going to like kill Tim Jones or whatever, you know, and you have to take him out of your deck and he's gone forever. He's dead.
And then you have to spend an action calling his family. Yeah. It's devastating.
Oh, Mark, you've played this too, right?
Yeah, I have played it. It's been a while, but I do remember enjoying it and thinking it was like a novel take on a skirmishy deck building war game.
Yeah.
But my question is, and this we could probably talk way too much about this, so just a real quick, but how do you guys feel in general about war games? Because that's one thing that I've wondered about, because this is a sort of a light, it's not an entry level or gateway or easy game to get into, but, I think if you're a board game player, this will strike you as a lighter game. And I wonder how many people who are interested in light games would be put off by a war game theme.
I mean,
not Neelan, because he's
yeah, exactly.
quick to back the Germans in World War II.
Right. I feel like I'd be interested to get your take on this in a second, Christina, but like I feel like I'm in the perfect like wheelhouse for this, because I'm someone that used to play a lot of war games, and and for that it wasn't typically like World War stuff, but Warhammer. I speak about Warhammer a lot. Like that is moving troops around the map, rolling a lot of dice, and people dying and not coming back. Like it replicates all of the same stuff, but this is condensed and streamlined and starts to integrate stuff I like a deck builder that doesn't really feel like other deck builders, which is just kind of cool. But you still have sort of the things that I associate as like the bad side of war games. Like you have a lot of dice rolls, and early on in the game I genuinely felt bad because when you have those games where you're rolling really well and the other person is rolling really badly, which Christina, that was happening to you a lot. You start to remember, this is why we don't play games that you roll a single die to determine combat anymore.
But it was not as painful, even though it was painful. Like, it was a short game, you know?
Yeah,
As
right.
opposed to that being a negative in, like, a game that you've invested so much time and energy into.
Absolutely. Because, like, let me tell you, when that happens at the beginning of a 3-hour game of Warhammer, it feels substantially worse.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. Like, I think the cost investment and, like, how quick this plays, because that's the other thing, like, turns move.
Yeah.
I thought it was really, really solid. I definitely wish that it wasn't World War II themed, but I liked it a lot.
Yeah. No, I feel the same way. I mean, I think that there's definitely an audience for this because I think that war games are really fun, but they're also a big, big time commitment, you know? Yeah. And I think that this just gives you that skirmishy feel in a much shorter time. And if you do want a longer game, but not investing in like 4 hours, you can just play 2 back to back, and there's different scenarios, you know? And so I definitely think that there's a crossover here. I mean, I hear what you're saying with like the theme. Yeah, I agree. World War II is a little rough, but yeah, I loved it.
Great.
That is Undaunted Normandy.
And that's by David Thompson. That's the designer of War Chest and the follow-up Undaunted.
North Africa? I think that's right. Yeah.
All right. So I got a chance to make a quick trip back down to LA where I finally got Fields of Arle to the table with my friend Dean, who was also kind enough to put me up for a night. Another person who put me up for a night was our very own Neelan. So that was nice as well. Although I
refused.
Yeah. I was begging and pleading and Christina put her foot down. Said, we'll never set foot in this place again. Although I'm a Uwe Rosenberg fan in general, I stayed away from Fields of Arle, despite hearing very good things about it, primarily, and appropriately enough given the episode topic today, due to the player count. Fields of Arle is a 1 to 2 player game. In the past, I stayed away from solo or strictly 2-player games, but because of the pandemic and my cross-state move, I found myself giving those games another chance. If you're familiar with classic Rosenberg farming simulator games, what you find inside the box won't surprise you. You've got sheep, you've got cows, horse meeples, the whole bit. You've got a lot of green and brown tiles. You've got resource tracks tracking how much flax and grain and cotton you have. And are you going to have to feed your people? You're damn right you're going to have to feed your people.
Do you have Uwe breeding?
You do have Uwe breeding. I think, actually, let me clarify, because so there are stalls and there are stables, okay? Uh-huh. In a stall, if you have 2 animals by themselves, they will breed.
Perfect.
In a stable, if you have 4 animals in a stable, you will have 2 breeding animals.
Wow.
So this is maybe a little bit of a takeoff, because you never have 2 breeds in the same box, right?
No, that is the staple of Uwe breeding.
This is when Uwe got a little wild.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the stables. It's the rule of stables. Everyone knows that.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Stables versus stalls. Stalls you get 1, stables you get 2.
Exactly.
Same, the old saying.
The old saying.
So like his other farming simulators, this is also a worker placement game. The game takes place over 9 seasons, each alternating season representing spring, then winter. So you go spring, winter for 9 rounds. During the spring rounds, you can only use the worker placement spots on the spring side of the board. And then during winter, you're restricted to the other half of the board. And every round, the first player marker shifts. So you'll start being first player on the spring, and then your opponent will be first player winter, and back and forth. However, once per round, someone can jump to the other season, so to the otherwise inaccessible season, and then forfeits the right to be first player the next round. So if we're playing in the winter season, but I really need to use a spot on the spring side of the board, I can jump over to it and take that action, but then nobody else can jump over. And I also forfeit my right to be first player, and my opponent is guaranteed the first player marker. So you're doing all this in an effort to, and this is again no surprise with an Uwe farming game, but you're trying to grow food, you're raising animals, you're building buildings, the usual. The worker placement spots will often give you resources or the ability to gain resources based on how far up you've gone on these associated tracks, and you can also increase your proficiency in these tracks. So when you go to a spot, instead of getting 3 wood, you'll get 4 wood or 5 wood or whatever. You're also trying to drain bogs on your board, and then you harvest the peat from the dried bogs for heat. And then once all the peat is gone, the fields are available for plowing and building upon. Christina, big smile on her face on the mention of peat.
Peat for heat.
That's right.
I just like peat for heat.
That's right. And who can blame you for that? And then furthermore, this is one of the sort of interesting takes in Field of Arle, is that one of the things you can acquire is a vehicle. So there are different types of vehicles you can acquire, and you use these vehicles, you load them up with goods and animals or other things, and you can deliver them to other towns for food and also travel experience points, which is a way to get points in this game. So I enjoyed Fields of Arle. It's funny, the comparisons to games like Agricola and Caverna are obvious, but I also found myself, and Dean I think was saying the same thing, seeing aspects of like things that you later see in Nusfjord and even Feast for Odin. So it's kind of cool to see the shared DNA there. That said, I didn't love it. I think this might have been a case of overly heightened expectations, as I'd heard the game was like absolutely amazing. I heard a lot of great things. It's also very well reviewed on BGG. And the thing is, I think that a lot of that positive stuff that I've heard might have been for the solo version primarily. So I'm very, very excited to dive into that. But I found the 2-player game good. And in my opinion, it's definitely better than Cave versus Cave, which is the other 2-player Uwe game I've played. I haven't played Agricola All Creatures Big and Small yet, but I'm looking forward to doing that. A bit of a problem I had with it is that it doesn't quite feel tight enough. By the end of Fields, I felt like I was able to accomplish most of what I set out to do. Not enough like Agricola in that respect. You know, Agricola, you feel like you never can do everything you want. In Fields, there's a little too much of that. Mm-hmm. Now, there is some replayability because there are a number of buildings that aren't used in every game. So you'll have like different buildings. And there are so few buildings that even a few changes there would make a game feel fresh. But I just feel like my desire to play is dampened when I feel like I got the most out of my first play of it. It's sort of like the anti-Marco Polo problem. The anti-Polo. Like in the original Marco Polo, you never feel like you can get everything done. So you always want to like play again and push things farther. And here, not so much.
It's funny how I see sometimes people like list that as a complaint. Like, oh, I couldn't get to do everything. And like to me, it's like, yeah, like you said, it's the exact opposite. Like that's what makes me want to keep coming back is feeling like, oh man, I was one turn away from being able to do that thing. And
there's a game that Neil and I played that we'll probably talk about on the next episode where I think we both had the same feeling about the game. Yeah. All that said, if you like Uwe farming simulator games and play a lot of 2-player games, I think Fields of Arle gets an unconditional recommendation. It is a really good game for sure. And if the solo mode is fantastic, all the more reason to try or get Fields of Arle by Uwe Rosenberg.
Yeah, I think that I've heard the same things you have about it being most solid in solo. So especially as soon as you bring up any like a Feast for Odin comparison, I don't know why I haven't picked this up yet. You should definitely try Agricola All Creatures Big and Small. I thought that was real solid as a 2-player adaptation goes. Oh, very good. There it is. Mark's holding it up to the camera. So I'm going to be talking about a new abstract game from Pandasaurus called That Time You Killed Me. When you look at this game from the outside, you have 3 boards, one which represents the past, one which represents the present, and one which represents the future. You are playing on all 3 boards, and the whole idea behind this game is that you are rival time travelers trying to eliminate the other player from the timeline so that you can be the person that solely invented time travel. The way that works out is on any given turn, you have one board that is your focus. You pick one of your pieces on that board and you can do 2 actions with it. Those actions are all really simple, so I'm just going to rattle them all off real quick. They're just either moving, which is just moving orthogonally, pushing, which is just a move into another player, and this is one of the main ways that you eliminate a piece. If you push them into a wall, you basically squish them, and that piece is basically eliminated from the game permanently. Another thing you can do is travel forward in time. So you move your piece to the next board over in the timeline, and as long as that space is unoccupied in the future, or you can move your piece back in time. But now if you think about it, if you're traveling back in time, there's going to be a future version of you that is going to show up. So you create a copy of yourself in the place that you traveled from. So you both move back in time one board and leave a copy behind, which is the only way that you get new pieces onto the board. But that supply is limited, so if you don't have any new copies available, you can no longer travel back in time. To win, you have to eliminate your opponent from 2 of the time periods. So if they're only alive on one board, you've won. That's the basic core of the game. And just from that alone, it starts to feel like almost literally like 4-dimensional chess, like this idea that anything you have can like have repercussions on the other 3 time zones. Because what's super important is at the end of your turn, you must move your focus to a different time period. So you're very carefully trying to figure out, okay, I'm going to do this action here, knowing that I have to do an action on a different board on my next turn. And when will I be able to get back to this board to act before my opponent can potentially do something devastating, like kill some of my pieces. There's another fun move in this where if you push a player's pieces into each other, then they touch each other, causing a paradox, eliminating both of them, which I think is just a fun little thematic touch. The way that this game twists us a little bit is that's just the basic setup. In fact, you're not really intended to play it with just that setup. There are these 4 boxes that each add new components and modify the rules in different ways, and you're sort of intended to move through them in like a campaign style. So I'm only going to spoil the first box here, so if you don't want any spoilers, cut ahead maybe a minute or two. But what that first box does is allows you to plant seeds, and when you plant a seed in the past, it becomes a bush in the future, which becomes a tree in the time period after that, and you can push those trees over to knock down the player behind them. So there's these fun setups you can do where you're both creating an obstacle in one time period that you can push people into and creating like a potential weapon in the future time period. So there's just like some fun machinations that work around that. Mark, you and I played this last night. What was your take on that time you killed me?
The only thing I knew about the game going into it was that I'd heard people say like the theme is sort of ridiculous. You know, it's basically an abstract game with this like very provocative title, and it doesn't really come out in the theme. And that's mostly true, although the idea of the past, present, and future, I think, is done in a very interesting way. But when Nealon set the board out, or the boards, I should say, out for the past, present, and future, the first thing that I thought of is chess. The boards are very chess-like. The pieces even look like chess pieces, although they all have the same movement rules, which is just one space orthogonally, aside from like the jumping in time. And that was one of the things that I really enjoyed about it. Not just the chess-like feel, but the idea that the rules were simplified. Like, you know, I've heard of people playing like 3D chess or 3D checkers, where you're playing 3 boards and one board can affect the other, but you still have to, you know, follow the chess rules in those cases. And in this, like, the rules are stripped down, but the twists make the game really interesting, but those twists aren't overly complicated.
Yeah.
So you're really just focusing on the gameplay, and you're not really having to worry so much about like, wait, what does this thing do? How do I jump back in time? Like, and again, the twists are simple, but they're really interesting. The fact that when you go back in time, you leave a copy, but to go forward in time, you are basically like losing one of your presents on that board. It's just a really fascinating twist on the game. And I ended up just loving this game. I really, really had a good time with it. I just feel like this is a game you could introduce to anyone. And it's interesting that I didn't know you weren't intended to play it with like just the basic rules. The time we played it with the first set of rules. But I feel like I would have loved it just with the plain rules. And I think you could introduce this game to anybody.
Right.
Just using the vanilla rules. They would have like a familiarity with it just based on the look of it alone. You know, you think checkers, you think chess. The movement rules are very simple. And then, again, even those twists would be very easy to explain. So I just think this is like a really great all-purpose game. I sort of almost wish that the title was different because it like makes you think it's something that it's not. Mm-hmm. But also, I wouldn't want it to have like a GIF title, like,
right,
you know, one
like
of
something
those,
super arbitrary. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just really, really enjoyed it. I loved it.
I know you said that the theme was kind of silly and the title's kind of silly, but did it like, when Nealon first started describing it, it felt like time travel. Like, did you feel that at all?
Yeah, from the way that the pieces move. I mean, thematic feels like too strong of a word. But just the idea that, you know, you got a board, which is the future, and a board is the present, a board is the past. And if you go back in time, you leave a piece there. I mean, that feels thematic. And like, if you jump ahead, you're losing a piece there. That did feel thematic. And even like a couple of the aesthetic touches with the board, like they're all identical boards, except the one in the future is a little cracked,
right,
and the one in the past is like pristine, and like the one in the future is starting to crack. So there's like even like that little touch, little flavor there as well that helps with it.
It's funny because this comes at a day where we're talking about thematic games a lot in the Discord, but I definitely wouldn't describe, you know, this is not a thematic game, but it is a game that uses its theme really, really well.
Yeah,
because most of the rules are tied to something about the time travel thing. You know, like pushing 2 pieces into each other, like that's a common like time travel trope. Like you touch yourself in the different timelines, you eliminate both of them. Things like creating a future version of self when you travel back in time makes sense. Like you start to like forget those little touches a little bit because it just becomes, okay, move back, make a copy, move forward, don't. But I like that they're tied to like a connective tissue. You know?
I mean, if it didn't have the theme, I would think that explaining that game to a non-gamer goes from like trivial to like actually now it's something, because now you have to tell like your Uncle Harry that like, okay, if you go from board 3 to board 2 or 2 to 1, you have to leave a copy.
Yeah.
And if you go from 1 to 2, you don't have
exactly.
to. But like giving it that veneer makes that much easier to
Exactly.
teach.
Go left and one thing happens, and go right another happens is so much more obscure than just like than what they've added to it, which I think is smart. I think that's really, really smart. And I think like also, not to get into specifics about even the first box or future boxes, but they use the time mechanic in fun ways where like things actually start to have a knock-on effect, like past to present to future, which I think is great. I think it's really, really great. I think like to your point, Mark, like I think what they've done is smart in that you can gauge your player rather and decide, okay, do we need the tutorial game without any fluff, or do we just go straight into like as intended if you're like an experienced gamer, for example? Because, you know, I had no doubts that we could easily jump straight into box one, but that might be different depending on whom you're playing with.
And honestly, like, I enjoyed the twist in box one, but I would play that game vanilla anytime.
Totally.
Like, anytime, for sure.
It reminds me in that way of Santorini a little bit, where it's like the game itself is rock solid, and to me, like the powers and that are just like cool fluff on top of like a solid core.
Sure, exactly.
I'm excited. I still have boxes I haven't opened yet, so I'm excited to like play more of it. That is That Time You Killed Me by Pandasaurus Games.
Before we get into our main topic, just a couple things. First, we are gearing up for Dice Tower West here in my new home city of Las Vegas. If you are going to be at Dice Tower West, it's probably a good time to check out our Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord as we start arranging meetups between listeners and meetups between ourselves and listeners and all that kind of stuff. Dice Tower West is a very game-playing focused convention, not as many like booths and sales things going on, so it's really a game players convention. So let's play some games together. So go to boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, and the conventions and meetups channel is probably the way to go, but that is certainly something that is on the horizon. And actually, while you're at Discord, just a quick shout out that I wanted to throw out there is the digital tabletop and the tournaments channels, which the tournament channel is primarily, I think, run by Mad Rex, one of our users, and they run tournaments on BGA and other digital board gaming implementations all the time. And I'm sort of in that rabbit hole now. I'm part of their Race for the Galaxy tournament and part of a La Granja tournament and part of a
Castles of Burgundy,
Railroad Inc. and Castle of Burgundy. Thanks for reminding me. So there are tournaments going on all the time. It's really fun to have that going on. The banter is really great.
And yeah, I'm talking about amazing two-player games. Like the Patchwork tournament just wrapped up.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, and was awesome. Like those tournaments were a lot of fun.
You finished above me in that, didn't you?
I did. I was I was in the top 10 somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was right in the middle. So unfortunately, yes, all that good stuff and more can be found at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. And while you are in the mood to do stuff for us, maybe, why not go ahead and leave us a review on your favorite podcast source, be it Apple Podcasts or wherever that is, and let people know what you think of the show. It helps get ears to the podcast, and we always appreciate it. And I, for one, I'm sure you guys feel the same way, that whenever we see a new 5-star review up there, it always makes my day, makes me happy and stuff.
Especially when it says
nice.
139.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. We've got a new number now to add to the collection. So if you want to throw in a 212, we'll also know what you're talking about. So yeah, thank you so much. And now on to our featured topic, which is 2-player games. I'll start because as I mentioned sort of with Fields of Arle, I've had a little bit of a fraught relationship with 2-player games. I used to stay away from 2-player only games like almost exclusively, unless I heard really, really good things. Like, you know, I've played Twilight Struggle and some of those like quote unquote like classics or modern classics, but in general, I stayed away from them for a number of reasons. One, because usually whenever I go to a game night, it was with a number of people, and if you're at a game night with like 6 people or 5 people or something, usually you just split up into like a couple 3s or a 3 and a 4 if you're with 7 people. And it just feels to me like if you have 6 people, it's strange to go 4-player and 2-player. I don't know why, but that always feels awkward to me. So I always gravitated towards multiplayer games. And I also had this feeling, unjustly now, given my experience with 2-player games nowadays, that they would just sort of devolve into like a very zero-sum push-pull thing. Like, I just didn't feel like there was enough give there. So I stayed away from them. But what got me back into being interested in 2-player games was, and again, I mentioned this with Fields of Arle, just, you know, circumstances with the pandemic and with my move, I found it far less frequent that I have a lot of players to play with. So what my entryway was playing games I would generally only play with 3 or 4 players and playing them 2 players and just finding out how great they were. A perfect example is Azul now. Azul is a game that I would almost always only have played with 3 players, 4 players maybe. Now I think Azul 2 is like my very, very much preferred way to play. Like, it's just such a cutthroat, interesting, pressure-packed game at 2, and it's now the way I enjoy it the most. That has become par for the course in a number of games that I would never have played 2 players. Now I prefer them at that count. So that was sort of like how my feelings have evolved when it comes to 2-player games.
I think that's exactly right for me as well. And I think it's because of that specific thing you mentioned, right? Where every action you take, you can work out how best it's hurting one specific person. You know, in the past, we mentioned how much we love Azul at like 3 or 4 players, but there is this element of chaos of just like, you don't want to be the person that's left with a bunch of tiles, but it's always a little bit uncertain how to like hurt the person that needs to be hurt the most. But that's what Azul at 2 players is all about. Okay, if I take this lot, then that leaves this one, which means that you're going to get these 5 tiles that you can't use. And I think that's great. It brings to mind something that really shines in certain 2-player specific games. So Christina and I just played a game of The Field of the Cloth of Gold, which is something I've spoken about previously. So I love this as like a really tense, really brutal 2-player game. And it has exactly that. It's like, what can I do that is most going to help me and hurt you the most? Although Cloth of Gold is a little bit weird in that often you're hurting yourself by taking any action in that game. But yeah, it just like exemplifies that feeling. I actually was curious to like touch on this a little bit because you've both now played this. I played this with you yesterday, Mark, and Christina today. Does that like ring true for you about like why it works as like a 2-player experience?
Yeah, I think so. I think that one thing that is interesting is that we all really like hurting each other. Like, we like games where we know exactly, like Neelan was saying, in certain multiplayer games, it's like you can't keep as close a track as you would like to. And like, how is my action impacting the players and how can I do the most damage to them and the most good to me? And so we really like that part of games, is being able to see exactly how we are ruining somebody else's gameplay and helping our own. And so I think, like Neelan said, that just really shines in 2-player, but it does make me think, like, I can see how a lot of people might not like that. And it's not that every 2-player game is fighty, but I do think the 2-player games that we gravitate toward tend to be a little fightier.
Yeah.
And yes, for that reason, I really liked The Field of the Cloth of Gold. It was painful, but those are my favorite types of games. It was very frustrating when every single turn, you know, to do anything, I had to help Neelan. Mark, what did you think of?
I echo pretty much exactly what you said. I have to admit that I'd heard a lot about the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Right?
Yep. The field of the Cloth of Gold.
This has got to be a Time's Up title because there's so many little words to get wrong. It would be hilarious.
So I have to admit, upon hearing about the Field of the Cloth of Gold and even seeing a quick playthrough of it, I didn't really think there was going to be like that much to it because it's a small production. It's done really nicely and the actions are so simple, but I absolutely loved it. And for the reasons Christina sort of mentioned, there's an argument to me that it is very zero sum, like you're doing this and the other player's doing that and all that stuff. But the way that it's twisted where every action that you want to do is only done after you give your opponent something, and that decision just sort of like multiplies how tough the other decision is. It just was such a interesting take and played so quickly and so cleanly. I really, really enjoyed it. Absolutely.
So I think my journey with 2-player games is a little bit different because I think that I've always enjoyed them just like full stop. I think this comes out more with my family because it's not very often that I get like my whole family to play a game. And a lot of times when I do, I've mentioned this before, but not everybody has the same taste for the same game. So I've played 2-player games with my brother, 2-player games with my sister. And I think I like thinking about what is the perfect game for this one person, for this pair, you know? And I think that that's in general, I feel like in life, I like smaller groups. And I think it's really nice to be able to do that, to like, I'm thinking about one person in the same way that you're thinking about how can I hurt that person during the game. Before the game, you get to think about like, okay, I know exactly what this person would like. I know what we would like. I know what would work for our circumstances or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I think I have ended up playing a lot of games that are multiplayer, 2-player. So Innovation is the most obvious example because I've played that at 2-player more than any other game and more than any other player count. And I think it's best at 2-player. And it's 100% an example of something where you're just 100% of your energy is focused on what the other player's cards are, what your cards are, how you can impact them and how they're impacting you and how you react to them impacting you. And it's just like this incredible, delicious back and forth with so much tension. And I mean, I need to stop talking about innovation. I know, I get it. But I think that kind of is just going along with what Neelan was saying. And then I love playing Biblios 2-player. I love playing Coloretto 2-player. I love playing Twice as Clever 2-player. Babylonia is incredible 2-player. So I think it's more recently that I have been playing just like only 2-player games. Lost Cities, I've just been like obsessed with for the last couple of years.
My guess would be that of the three of us, you probably have the most 2-player games logged in. And also, I mean, you obviously have Kellen as a gaming partner and you guys play quite often. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I think is interesting is that you have a lot of bigger games that have come out with like dual versions. So the biggest example for me would be Cthulhu Wars, incredible experience at multiplayer, and a surprisingly incredible experience with Cthulhu Wars Duel, the 2-player version, which is fairly new. And I think the like side benefit of that is just how much more accessible it is. It's a lot more affordable. So I think that that's a really good example of a game that really benefited from having a 2-player version. Another game which I can't be trusted when I talk about Cosmic Encounter because I just don't like the game, but I've also played Cosmic Encounter Duel, so the 2-player version of that, and that to me felt like they really shouldn't have done that. Like I already didn't like the game and then it was even worse at 2-player. But again, I think that might be a little bit because I didn't love the original game. But I do believe that Kellen didn't. He felt that there were some problems with it as well. So I think it's just more interesting, this kind of, and I don't know how trendy this trend is, but just like this idea of taking games that like could be played 2-player and creating a 2-player only version of that game.
I wonder how much of that was actually, I mean, I know that game development takes a long time, but I wonder how much of that was motivated by the pandemic, for example, because suddenly you have a lot of people stuck indoors with one part. I know that I was playing a lot more 2-player stuff over the course of the last 2 years just as a result of that. But yeah, it made stuff like, okay, well, I want to play Cthulhu Wars, but I don't have the people to play it with right now. So much more appealing in the form of like Cthulhu Wars Duel. I also love that point you made about tailoring a game specific to one person, because without even realizing it, there was a little bit of that happening with me today where, we knew we wanted to do this episode and we knew that the best way to do that was to like play some 2-player games with each other. So I have an array of games that I could have proposed to you, but when I saw Undaunted Normandy, I was like, okay, fighty game, area control, deck building. They're all things that we both like.
World War II German.
Exactly. And I get to be the Germans. So it was just ticking all of the boxes.
Yeah.
But, like we had spoken about like doing That Time You Killed Me, which we didn't end up doing together. But like suddenly it's just like, okay, it's Christina. So what is the game that I want to play with Christina? And that is so much more impactful when it's just you and one person.
That is actually a very fascinating idea because, sometimes when you have a group of people playing together, even if you have 2 people and they have even slightly different tastes, you're like, hey, which game is,
which is like the compromise game.
Yeah, exactly. But when you're playing a game versus somebody else, you can be like, okay, this is a game that fits her wheelhouse,
right?
Or, their wheelhouse. Yeah,
and it reminds me actually because, there are games I have specifically bought with a person in mind.
Sure,
So I have still not played this yet, but I bought the BioShock Infinite board game, which is a board game license on a video game that I don't think is very good. But I have a friend that loves BioShock Infinite. So, of course, I'm going to play that game with them. It reminds me of just like I spoke about War of the Ring last week. And myself and Daniel are such huge Lord of the Rings fans that it's only natural that Daniel would be like, oh, I have to play this with you.
Sure.
So I think that's such a great point, Christina. And like it gives you so much more ability to like cater an experience to a specific person. One of the things I kind of also wanted to talk about quickly, and, it's rare that I get that fully into a deck construction game anymore. And by this, I mean something like a Magic the Gathering where you are building a deck between games. But there is something that's so specific about building a deck to counter someone else's play, especially when I was in high school. You know, I remember back to Magic the Gathering specifically, and my friend builds a incredibly overpowered elf deck, for example. And then the only thought running through my head the rest of the week is, what do I build to beat him specifically, you know? And like that joy of like constantly refining that deck until it's better and better against that person, that's the thing I love about that style of like deck construction dueling card game. It's something that was like such a joy in Netrunner, for example. When I was playing that frequently at work, the conversation is always, well, Anthony has this like ridiculously powerful Jinteki or whatever deck. Like, what do we do to like beat that? And there's something that's so specific about two-player, that you versus one other player and their specific like makeup, their specific deck, that I think is like really, really powerful. It's something that gets captured somewhat by like the modern vein of like more deck builder games, like something like an Eternal Chronicles, but it's not quite the same. Like, as much as I love those as the shorthand to that, there's something I always miss about like the Netrunner type model, the Magic the Gathering type model, which, yeah, it's just so singular in that focus on like what you need to do to bring down someone.
And although this is not as focused as that, I think that is also something that happens in all two-player games, that you get to play a lot. Like, for example, I'm playing a lot of instant rematch games of Race for the Galaxy with some listeners now. And, you know, we may have started off at different sort of levels, and maybe we're not the same level now when we play it, even after we've played like 30 or 40 games. And sadly, I'm usually on the lower end of the level. But you can see yourself sort of like, if you're both beginners, you can see yourself both get proficient at the game at the same time. And that's a cool thing. Or if you're slightly behind somebody or somebody slightly behind you, and you play 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 over and over again, you see that sort of like coalescing of levels, like they sort of like start even out. And it's kind of cool to see, and this has happened to me in Race for the Galaxy, where either I was ahead initially or they were ahead initially, and then finally there was a breakthrough, or one person was passed, and then like the other person catches up, and like there's like a meta that you have to like sort of catch up on. And even for a game that, you know, doesn't really lend itself to a meta as much as a game like Magic the Gathering would, but when you're playing with somebody so many times, and a lot of two-player games will lend themselves to quick repeated plays. Obviously nothing like War of the Ring or anything like that.
Yeah, running War of the Ring back to back is a
right.
stretch.
But like Lost Cities or games like that, you could play over and over again. And then even games that are not strictly Lost Cities, I'm going to go back to Azul now. I've played a lot of games with our friend back in LA, Moria, and they are great at the game. They're the strongest Azul player I've ever played against, and I'll win one out of every X amount of games, but I've learned a lot playing against them, because I really see what high-level two-player Azul playing is, and it's just like, I've gotten such an appreciation from that game, just like learning it from something like that. In a two-player, you take an action, I take an action, there's no slack, there's no chance for like randomness from a third player. You've got to be on top of your game sort of situation.
I think it's also interesting. I feel like I hear when people play a game at multiplayer and then they want to know, like, but is it good at two-player? And if it's not, there's a little bit of like, well, the game's not good then. Like, I don't know that any of us would agree with that, but I was just thinking that's kind of an interesting, like, I do love when you get to learn more about a game by playing it at different player counts. And I would say that's what I prefer. Like, I don't necessarily care as much if a specific multiplayer game is not good at two. I just like if there's different things to learn and explore at different player counts.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, like a lot of games will feel so different, and not sometimes worse and better, but a lot of times they'll just feel like way different playing them at two and a 3 and a 4 or whatever counts, and you just feel like you almost have like a brand new game there, but one that you have a familiarity with. So it's like you don't have to learn all the rules all over again. You know the rules, but it's like a fresh take on it.
Yeah.
I have a good recent example of this actually that just came to mind, which is that we have at various points played Ginkgopolis with each other. I think Kellen and Mark and I played this when we played it for the first time. I played a few games of this on Board Game Arena. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, I like Ginkgopolis, but I kind of don't love it because there's a little bit of like chaos to the cards you get and how tactical it is and what you're able to do on a turn. But I played it recently for the very first time at 2 players, and I loved it. Like, everything that bugged me about it suddenly transformed into a positive. Like, I know that if I don't have a card, it's because Daniel had it. And I know that if I'm not winning a district, it's because Daniel was winning that district. And I don't necessarily think, and this is going to sound a little bit like I'm being wishy-washy about it, I don't think that's necessarily the best player count for everyone. And I think that, BGG, for example, would prove that out if you were to look at the player count recommendations. But I think it's the best player count of Ginkgopolis for me,
Yeah.
And
100%.
it just made it feel so much more calculable is not the right word, but so much more strategic. Like, you could focus your attention on what one person was able to do and work against that.
So that is going to do it for today's episode, but maybe go to boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, and while you're getting ready for Dice Tower West and talking to people there or signing up for the next digital tournament, why not go to the podcast channel where we discuss that week's podcast and talk about what your feelings are about 2-player games, maybe what your favorite 2-player games are, or maybe what your favorite multiplayer games are that have a 2-player version that you really like. I would love to learn more about that as, again, my eyes have been opened about games like Azul and the like. So, yes, so feel free to visit boardgamebarrage.com/Discord and let us know there. You can reach us at all the various forms of social media. We're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all that kind of stuff. You can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. You can find the website at boardgamebarrage.com. Basically, if you type in Board Game Barrage, you'll have a plethora of options at which to see our stuff or find us. And you can find us again in person a month from now, a little under a month from now, at Dice Tower West. As always, a big thank you to Heart Society for our intro and outro song, What's on Your Mind, Kid? And until next week, when the Red One returns, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Catchphrase. So every time that Neelan is attacking one of my riflemen, I know it's like all the names I thought of were not good names. I thought of Joseph Stalin. I don't know why.
You got the promo pack, it sounds like.
Don't include that. I'm going to think of a name. Give me a second. Neelan is going to kill. Also, by the way, you might, if you type in Board Game Barrage, you'll definitely get a lot of results for us, but you might also get the board game called Barrage. You might get that result. So you wouldn't believe the amount of people who have called us being like, hello, do you have the game? Do you have the board game Barrage? and we'd say, we are Board Game Barrage. Oh. No.
I thought Kellen might have a number out there that was getting calls from people looking for that.